There we go. We're live. We're recording. Yay. Hello. Welcome to the Ponderings of Pete. This is the channel that I am Pete, of course. But this is a channel where I talk about books, fantasy, sci-fi, whatsoever, books that happen to cross my page. And today we're going to be doing an author interview. If you are new here, welcome. I go ahead and feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. If you're coming back, thank you so much for supporting me and all the authors and then all this other jazz, because it's wonderful. We just love your support to talk about books, because talking about books is what we're all here for, right? Today I'm going to be doing an interview here with J.R. Tross. I'm not entirely sure what his middle name is, but the first name is Julian.
It's a mystery that will be lost to time.
I mean, hey, I was watching another video. I can't remember who I was talking to you about, like how, like, as you get bigger in fantasy, you earn more R's. Eventually, you'll be J.R.R. Tross, right?
Yeah, I'm working on it. I'm hoping for that full Tolkien initial set. JRRT. I'm almost there.
Almost. You just got one more R you have to acquire through an epic quest.
Yeah, that's right. It's like getting a black belt, but you have to like break a bunch of boards and save a few villagers and find a magic sword.
Maybe toss a ring into the fire somewhere.
Yeah, but no eagle riding, because that's the cheap way around it. You can't use the eagles or you don't get the initial.
Yeah, because of course the Eagles could never have taken them to Mordor. That wouldn't have worked at all.
It wouldn't have been fair.
No, it wouldn't have.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super thrilled. I appreciate the invite a lot.
No problem. So do you want to tell them about, like, kind of some of the books you've written, some of where they can find you, all that jazz?
Yeah, sure. I've written a bunch of different works by myself. I've written works in collaboration with others, most noticeably my friend Silas Jackson, and he'll probably watch this. So hey, Si. Our works can be found on Amazon predominantly. I have a website, blankbooklibrary.com, where you can find some of the lore and things that I've posted for my most recent trilogy that I'm working on, which is the Aelfraver trilogy. The first two books are out, The Rave being one that was released in 2021, and The Rebel, which was just released in June of this year. And it is an epic trilogy in scope and in size, but I'm very proud of it so far. And I guess I should just say that it's like I'm calling it arcane punk cyber fantasy. So like a blend of sci-fi, far future technology. Like, what if a fantasy world existed, thousands of years ahead of what our contemporary technology would be? So.
Yep, and that's primarily the books that I've read by you. I haven't really dived into the rest of your backlog yet, even though some of the books that you've talked to me about sound very interesting, like the whole absurd birds are not for the cat and
that's one of the ones with Silas, and I definitely will say very different flavor than The Rave and The Rebel. The Rave and The Rebel are meant to be like YA plus, like you can enjoy it at any age, I presume, but like Birds Are Not for the Cat and Bagman, I will say a lot of fun. Definitely 18 plus or parental guidance for both of those, just because language and some themes that might be a bit much for younger readers, just depending on what people's preferences are. So I just thought I'd throw that warning out there at the front. But I like them. They're very absurd, very insane, and very funny. So Birds Not for the Cat still probably my favorite thing that I've written, just because I had so much fun writing it with Silas.
Nice. Yeah. So for the first part of this, we'll kind of talk spoiler-free for the most part for The Rave and The Rebel. I think part of the way through we'll probably switch over, because I recently finished The Rebel. I think there's definitely some interesting questions I have, or I think they're interesting, but
Absolutely.
Just kind of like where the series might be going, all that jazz. So, spoiler free, talking about the Aelfraver trilogy, what how did you come up with the Aelfraver, the world that it takes place in?
Yeah, well, it kind of goes in. There's just sort of this crystallizing moment where suddenly a bunch of things will click for me usually. but I can trace huge influences and things that I wanted to explore that started the idea. At the time, I was starting to read the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski, and I mean, everyone knows the Witcher shows and video games more so, but the novels are very interesting, and the pacing is so weird, and the characters all have these such like detailed backstories. You really feel like they have decades of lives that they've had that have no bearing on the current plot. You just feel like they're such full-bodied characters. So I stole two things from The Witcher. One was the concept of a monster hunter and like a monster hunting organization, and two, I wanted to try to have characters that felt like they had lives and stories outside of the plot of the trilogy that I was writing. Um, and then I very consciously thought, okay, monster hunting. I don't want to just literally rip off The Witcher and Monster Hunters, which are a staple of YA. I wanted to write a YA story specifically, but I thought, well, what would make life really difficult for a monster hunter? I know. What if they didn't kill the monsters, and what would that look like? And so, thus, eventually, the concept of Alina was born. But in my first notes, it was just like, hero, protagonist, monster hunter, whatever it was. So I wanted to create that monster hunter that doesn't kill monsters, and then I also I really enjoy a lot of stories with crazy magic systems, and there's definitely a sort of notes of anime in some of the ways that the magic systems work. I think big fan of Full Metal Alchemist, and I was watching Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood before I started writing this. So I was like, there's the guy that can snap his fingers and shoot fire and whatever. And I was just thinking elemental magic systems. How do we weave this together in a way that's interesting, but also have guns and swords and hover cars? And it's pretty much just in a nutshell, what are all the coolest things that I can think of, and how do I cram them into one series? So I guess that's the short of it.
Nice.
The first idea that I ever had for it, I was looking back, I dated the entry, it was 2017. I was like, wouldn't it be cool? And I drew the capital city with the chains holding it down. These were the very first notes that I had. So it's changed a lot since then, but there are definitely these currents. And I guess who doesn't like that anime flavor of, the badass, over the top, magically powered superheroes smashing into each other and blowing stuff up?
Yeah, I definitely see notes of that in with Barum and then some of the other things that happen in the Rebel.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Baram is probably, without saying why, he's probably the most anime character in terms of shonen anime.
So with the monsters, are there specific places that you kind of got inspiration from for the elves? Because there's a lot of different types of elves in your world, and how do you pronounce it? Is it do you because every time I say elf, I think it sounds like I'm saying elf, but I'm trying to pronounce the A little bit.
Well, so I will admit, I'm a bit of a language nerd, and I don't know everything, but I did purposefully just sort of take the word elf, and I looked at some of the older High German and Old English ways of spelling these words and what it meant. And I remember reading somewhere that elves are this much more amorphous concept than our modern concept of elves, which are either little fairy tale creatures or Tolkien elves, which are the Norse beautiful elves. I remember reading in the Terry Pratchett book, Lords and Ladies, elves were these kind of monstrous tricksters and everything. And there have been so many different adaptations of them that I thought to myself, well, if elves can literally be anything, then elf can be anything as well. And so I thought of it as humanity oversimplified hundreds or thousands of species of different creatures into one thing. It's humans, animals, and then everything else that is not basically non-magical animals, and then you've got magical monsters. That's what the Aelf are. But then there are different levels, of course. Like you've got the sentient ones and the non-sentient ones. There are ones that have what you could say are very relatable, human-esque motivations, and then some that are just um, they just do what they do. They run around, they rampage, or they exist outside of the scope of human civilization. So when I was creating each of the monsters, what I usually do is I create them individually based on the need that they should fulfill in the story. So there are some that I kind of made up to fill out the cast, if you will, like the peripheral creatures. If you read the ridiculously long glossary that I wrote, there's a bunch of different species that are not critical in any way. But the ones that appear in the story, I consciously develop like what they're like and their power set and their origin. And I think you see a little bit of that in the Rebel, especially with how they relate to the antagonistic human forces, right? They're characters and species that are Aelf that have a very closely tied to humanity history. And so everything about them was sort of tailored to highlight that division and conflict, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes sense. And that kind of brings me a little bit to one of my other questions involving kind of like I guess you could call it the corporate overlord theme that you have going on in the series. What I know that has roots in cyberpunk, but was that like the only was that one of the only like inspirations for that? I was like, where did that come from for you?
That. Yeah, I mean, definitely. That is definitely partially me trying to incorporate some cyberpunk themes to make it a cyber fantasy. Because I think to fully make it like this blend of science and technology and like sword and sorcery, I don't think it's enough to just be like, and there are guns and swords. You have to have the elements of society that make those things what they are. You know, you have to kind of, and then you get to thinking about history, right? Like in what world did this blend of technology and magic come up? Mm-hmm. So one of the earliest things that I did was I came up with the backstory. Because I just had this idea of like main character in cyber fantasy world, but how did this even come about? And so I don't know how deep I can go into spoiling the lore, so I'll just keep it very simple and say events that happened 3,500 years ago are referenced several times, and the systems that are in play, this sort of like corporate monopoly of everything, are the direct result of sort of the mythological underpinnings and reasons for why this all happened. To put it, I guess, vaguely enough, the 12 champions is what I'm referring to, right? And how the 12 champions are the stated reason that the 12 families, their descendants, are in power. And just over the course of the warlords and their families being in power for hundreds of years, they eventually just transformed into a more modern form of governance, which is, a federal government and what's the word I'm looking for? I guess the buying and selling of goods, right? I guess I went into it consciously saying, what if you had a world where all these other things were true and it was literally a plutocracy where there is no apology made for the fact that the wealthiest are the most powerful?
Yeah.
I was mainly just trying to imagine a world that was, I guess, had some things in common with ours, but where things are presented very differently. There are very powerful corporations in our world today, but in this world, it's like, what if Walmart was literally the government?
Yeah, kind of like almost a Wall-E situation to a certain extent.
Exactly. Yeah. So that seemed interesting to me as well. Like, what if that was just literally the truth, and that had been accepted fact for hundreds of years? What would the world be like? Would people accept it? Would they not? And I just like to make playgrounds where there's a lot of tension on like a high overarching level, but then also the individual stakes where that's maybe the overarching level exacerbates some of the problems, but the interpersonal is the focus of this trilogy for sure.
Yeah, and I think that makes several of the characters very relatable, considering that, you know, that world, that plutocracy where the wealthy are unapologetically in control, essentially, is something that there are a lot of people out there that fear either is or might happen very soon. And that individual level of somebody who's not in the wealthy class that you have with your characters, or is, you know, the rebellion against it is on an individual level, is something that is very relatable in characters that I can't name yet.
Right. Yeah, well, I didn't at all come up with this idea, but I think it's true generally that in good science fiction, people always talk about like, oh wow, 1984 predicted the possibility of a fully autocratic state in which thought is policed and everything. Um, that's not really the case. It's more just that 1984 was written in the context of like the current political and social situation where sci-fi writers basically are commenting on the world that they live in and the trends that they are seeing,
Mm-hmm.
and creating a fantasy around that, if you will. So it's not in my it's not my focus or my interest to make a political statement, but I don't think that it's possible for like your perception of the things that are going on around you to not enter your writing at all. I just try to be as I guess compassionate and well-rounded about it as possible. I try to present characters who are on all sides of that, and I can't say who because it'll be a spoiler, but there definitely is the character who's very much in agreement with the system and the status quo as is, and I tried really hard not to present them as a bad guy. I tried to present their opinions as very reasonable from their particular point of view, you know. So that's my main interest. I love it when there's like a big cast of characters, protagonists and antagonists, that are really just at odds because they can't agree on how to solve the problems.
Yeah, and that's an interesting concept because, like, within fiction with protagonists and antagonists, they tend to be very, very much at odds. And it's enjoyable to sometimes see a situation, even where you have protagonists that may or may not agree on what to do about a problem.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's definitely none of that in the books that I write.
Of course not.
My characters never argue.
Of course not. That's not how conflict works sometimes. But it's interesting to see a situation where there's a possibility of reconciliation, even between protagonists and antagonists. And I haven't gotten the that much of an impression that that's necessarily like the end goal, especially with some of the things that are going on in this world, in your world. Sorry. But being someone who is very much a systematic thinker, someone who is, that's a term that I made up, but it's someone who enjoys figuring out how systems work. Like, that's why accounting was kind of appealing to me. It was just like, it's all about systems. I tend to be the person who looks at a system and tries to change it versus tearing it all down type of deal. So I definitely tend to resonate with characters that are like, hey, let's try to change it from the inside.
Yeah. So. And it's my hope that you come out of reading this trilogy, the general you, unclear on what I believe. That is really my main goal. I read somewhere, I'm going to butcher the paraphrase, but if the author's opinions are overt, then you're being proselytized to, preached to. So a good author removes their opinions, makes their opinions invisible, and allows the reader to come up with, who was right and who was wrong, even if that means disagreeing with how the protagonist handles things. And definitely some of the people who've read The Rave and the Rebel have said they've completely disagreed with how the main character cast has handled certain situations. And I just sort of like lean back in my chair, steeple my fingers, and say, yes, exactly. You're supposed to think that these are flawed individuals who sometimes make mistakes.
Yep.
Especially because a lot of them are kids, right? Teenagers. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I made my share of mistakes and rash decisions when I was a teenager.
Absolutely.
And if I had been able to shoot fireballs as well, I think that would have been just a terrifying combination.
Yeah, it is a terrifying. Giving any sort of magic powers to teenagers is always kind of like, what? This is going to go badly, kind of, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not knocking it, but there are definitely a lot of like magic school tropes in YA especially, and I think a lot of them are done really well. But I'm definitely more of a fan. Like in my own work, I wanted to just approach it from, okay, but these are people with emotions, and a lot of them are ruled by their emotions. So they're not always going to use their powers to do the right thing or to like target specifically that guy. There's going to be a ton of collateral damage, emotional and otherwise.
Yeah, or they might not. They might have the right idea, but they go about it the wrong way.
Yeah, like people.
Yeah, people don't do that. What? People are perfectly rational, right? We're readers. We know that people are perfectly rational and do the right decision every time.
That's right.
We're in no way disconnected from the characters we're reading.
Yeah, so, who knows if it paid off, but I definitely went into it with that idea. I think the term morally gray characters gets thrown around a lot, but I'd say more that these are just, they switch sides, they make knee-jerk decisions, they hurt each other, but ultimately I wanted to also present this thing where they can also come back together and heal, as cheesy as that sounds. I wanted it to be a book very much about empathy, where empathy is almost like a weapon in this world, or like I guess it's a double-edged sword. You can use it to justify terrible things, but also to come together and actually talk things through and see where the other person is coming from. So to your point earlier about like antagonists and protagonists seeing where each other are coming from, I just find that idea really fascinating mainly because that's the real fantasy. Like how often does that happen in real life, right?
Exactly. Well, it's a thing that I wish would happen more.
Yeah, I'm sure that it does happen. It's just, yeah, exactly. I wish that it would happen more. So if I'm attempting to indoctrinate the youth in any way, that's the way that I would like to indoctrinate them. Just encourage them to see the other side a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. But no, that's not possible. Of course not. So how would you say was writing book 2 any different from writing book 1? Like what changed between the books or whatever for you, and what did you decide to do differently with book 2?
Yeah, well, quite a few things. So this is a good question, for sure. The first book I wrote over a longer period of time. I should say the bones of everything were written before the first page of The Rave was ever put down on paper. I have a direction, I have things that I want to happen, and little things change over time. But I'd say the main difference was I actually started putting The Rave out there to, booktubers such as yourself and others, and actually getting some kind of a response. And then when people read the book and talked about it, I was like, oh God, I've got to now do that again. I've got to try to match that level of semi-decent quality and give people the kind of product that I've now led them to expect. I guess I'm just saying I never really had, before this, any kind of major eyes on my book, even just the bunch that have come out of it, thanks to, the kind words of booktubers. So I guess there was a little bit of that pressure, to do it again, to top it, right? To top it again. but I tried to silence that voice and just say, well, here's what you do. You take the feedback, you take the criticism, you listen to what people said. And I had a lot more feedback on this one from a wider variety of sources. So there were a few notes and things that I changed in my outline of the Rebel before I started writing it, thanks to feedback. So that was really cool, actually. I found that incredibly constructive. And I think as a result, at least in my opinion, The Rebel is a better book for it. And I'd say that it tops The Rave just because it's the product of my redoubled efforts and the voices of others kind of contributing thoughts and where they wanted to see it go.
Yeah. And I think it definitely shows. I feel like there's a lot. There just feels like a lot more in The Rebel, not just from page count, but just from intensity, especially in those last couple hundred pages, were absolutely intense. And I think that's really all I can say at this point. But
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for saying so. Very much tried to make that happen. As huge as the book is, I mean, in total, it's about 200 pages longer than The Rave, so that's a big difference. But I tried really hard to deliver as much or more content in those pages, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And just to kind of lay bare my reasoning for it, I thought really hard about avoiding the second book slump in a trilogy. I really, really wanted to make this a book that could theoretically stand on its own, at least to some extent. Like you could read this whole thing and get an enjoyable experience out of it, I would hope. But then it also has to do the hard work of bridging where I want the third book to end up. And as I was thinking about it, I was like, there's so much that still has to happen in the third book. This book has to do all these things. I kept thinking, my friend was saying, okay, but what if you cut it in half? And I said it would be a trilogy, and it'll be a trilogy, by God, And I kept thinking, what can I cut? What can I cut? And as I was editing, I went through everything with a fine-tooth comb, and I consulted multiple people about it. And I said, well, what if I cut here? And I actually was talking to my friend Silas about it, the one who I keep bringing up, and he said, but if you did that, then this would collapse, and that would collapse. It really seems like all of these scenes are necessary for what has to happen and develop. So it is a behemoth of a book, but I did, in my own flawed human way, try to make every single decision and every single scene count for something, even if it's not immediately in this book apparent why, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something that I think more people wish that. I come across talking to some people like, these books are overbloated and these scenes need to have more purpose, and they don't have any purpose at all. So it's good to hear that you're working towards having purpose in every scene. I don't, at least in your process, that makes me feel, I don't know, great, because that's like when I start writing, that's something I want to do. So that's good to see that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean the classic, I guess, catchphrase is come in late and leave early, right? Like start the scene as close to the action as possible and then get the heck out. Now, like I said, I there are probably places where it could be tightened up. You learn and you grow until the day that you die, and who knows, maybe after that too. But it's a process, and I think that just from my own point of view, this is the best book I've ever written in terms of the delivery, like the technical delivery of a product where everything was, the result of the decades that I've been writing and practicing. I really like The Rave still. I think that this is technically a better book in terms of the content, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that effort shows.
It does. How much of so you mentioned you had an outline of the entire series when you started.
Mm-hmm.
On an individual book level, how much of a planner or a pantser, or what is it, architect or gardener, tools terms?
Yeah.
for yourself to be?
Yeah. Well, I started off as a total pantser.
Mhm.
That when I first wrote my stories, I was 11, so I was like, well, here's words on a page, and I think somewhere in my, not too long ago, in maybe like 8 or 9 years ago, I started thinking, well, I really should have more of a system. So I tried multiple different outline methods, um, but then I found this book, and if if you've ever heard me talk about writing, you'll have heard me mention this book. And I'm sorry to anyone who's heard this before, but the book is called, uh, well, it's by John Truby, and it's the 22 Steps to Becoming a Master Storyteller. The Anatomy of Story. That's the main title. So I won't say that this is like the be all end all of writing structure, but it did sort of change my fundamental approach to how to structure stories. The Rave and the Rebel are the first books that I've written following my sort of hodgepodge of my ideas and his ideas of how to structure. Um, so it's a very good book to check out for any aspiring writers. I found it super helpful. And like I said, take it in with all the other things you read about writing and all the videos you watch about writing, and kind of just take what's useful and leave what isn't. But what it allowed me to do was come up with this. Nope, my cat has arrived to say hello. Hey, Riddle.
Hello.
Riddle. Yeah, sorry, surprise cameo.
Always appreciate. Pets are always appreciated.
She's a sweetie. She has no sense of propriety, but she's a sweetie.
That sounds about cat.
Right. So anyway, sorry. Structuring. So what's interesting about this method that I'd never done before is I started with a premise. Wouldn't it be cool if there was a monster hunter who had no desire to kill, and that made her life super difficult? And then the rest of the premise is a spoiler, so I won't say it. But I started from there, and then the other cool thing about it is you start thinking about all of your characters, all of your main cast of characters, immediately as opposite to each other. You create what this four-corner opposition. So like I had my main character, and then I had my main villain, and then I had the other two side characters, and they're all supposed to be opposed to each other on different facets, down to their personality and all the way up to their position in society. And through them, you can build your society, how it works through conflict. So what's really cool about this system is it builds in interpersonal conflict, and therefore life and drama at a structural level, which is very cool. You automatically have these fundamental forces at play from the get-go. And then the other really interesting thing about it that I should say is genre is like a last thought. It's sort of like the skin you overlay on your story. Because you could make the Rave a Western if you wanted to. You just have to pull away a lot of the like surface level stuff. Don't mention hover cars. Instead, they're horses, right? You can do whatever you want. There could be monsters out in the Wild West. I think you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So that was a different approach, because usually I came to writing from the perspective of, well, genre first, then main character, and then you go from there. So this was a fundamental structural overhaul that, I don't really plan to go back. Until I find like a new thing to incorporate, like a brand new system to completely change my mind. This has sort of become a really good yardstick and cornerstone for my process.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I am always reading new books on writing to try to sharpen my skills and incorporate new techniques. But so far, this has been like another very solid piece in my corner to hold it all together.
Nice. Yeah, and the more you talk about like the opposition, like I can definitely see that shining through in the writing, in the characterization, and that's not something that I've heard before, but I am working constantly to educate myself, slowly but surely, more than anything. So that's interesting. How did that structure change? Did that structure change that much between books 1 and 2? At least the opposition structure?
Yes and no. I love giving that answer. No, in that I did still use the same type of structure, but yes, in that I doubled it like a fool. In my hubris, I thought to myself, well, but what if I did all of it again, but with two main characters now? And that was, I wouldn't say that's a mistake. I think a good book came out of it, but in all honesty, it's I would say amazing that I came out with a coherent book with two main character arcs and like a sub arc for one of the antagonists and a subplot character arc, right? I had to plot all of those things out and kind of have them come together by the end of the book. The Rave has the main character Alina and her plot arc, and then a subplot character and some other stuff. The Rebel has the two main characters, the antagonist and the subplot character, and then like a bunch of peripheral characters who are also doing stuff. So again, I can only call it hubris, thinking, well, what if I just make the most technically difficult book that has ever been written by me? And what if I do that in a year and 8 months?
Yay!
Yeah, so I have proved my point that I'm insane, and now I rest on my laurels of insanity.
Sounds like a good life. After writing books 1 and 2, how is that going to change how you write book 3? Are you going to double it again?
Hell no. No, absolutely not. I can't say exactly what the structure will be, but let's just say, well, because I feel like I'd be delving into. Okay, I think I can. What I will say is, The Rebel is a story about divergent, like, character intentions. The two main characters are kind of in opposition to each other for a big chunk of the story. So that adds a layer of complexity there. In the third book, that will not be the case. There's more of a sort of like a grand arc between the forces on one side and the forces on another, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the coming together of all of the promised conflict and disasters that I've lined up for you by books 1 and 2.
Definitely, I think both of your books have done fantastic with kind of setting up the next chapter, but not making that the focus of the entire book, if that makes sense. They do a good job of kind of giving a little tease, whether it's throughout or at the end, that provides the basis for the next book, and the reader can easily know what the next book is going to be sort of about. And I think The Rebel went a different way than I thought it would. But the seeds of that basis were still kind of there at the end of that last book, at the end of the first book.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the compliment. I definitely appreciate it. I very much wanted it to be like, okay, hopefully you've enjoyed this whole story, and the answers that were raised in this book should be delivered by the end of this book. I'm a big fan of like having the stuff that I wanted to know answered in this book. I don't really want to have to read 8 books to finally get the payoff for the character arc.
It's just series like that.
It's just a personal preference. I know that some people don't mind, and there's something to be said for the whole Amazon marketing scheme of like delivering shorter novels and novellas, and kind of doing that at a set schedule. It makes sense. Bagmen is more that way, the one that I wrote earlier. But with this book, these 2 books, I very much wanted it to be, you get what you paid for, which is a complete story. And then here's, like you said, like the Marvel comics, the Marvel movie teaser of like, but wait, now Thor's hammer has appeared in the sand. You thought you were done with Iron Man, but here we go. And yeah, that was a conscious effort. And so hopefully it feels, I mean, it is a cliffhanger, but hopefully it feels more like an addendum, like almost like the preview of book 3 chapter that sometimes they'll do in fantasy books like that.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a lot of the arcs that you set up for book 2 were conclusively ended in a satisfying way.
Good.
With room for more in the end, with room for book 3. So
yeah, I didn't want the whole thing to be like the whole trilogy to be Alina figuring out, who she is and what her place in the world is, right? That's sort of the first leg of her journey, and then there's more to come.
Of course, yes, the more. So outside of, I guess this will be like the final question before we go into spoilers. Outside of Aelfraver, do you have any other projects that you're thinking about working on, or some semblance of that?
Absolutely, yes. I will say that this trilogy has taken like 90% of my brain power, just because of the scope of it. I've for sure never written anything on my own this big. But I definitely have some projects in the work that I'm very excited about. One of them was co-written again by Silas Jackson, and myself, and it's a trilogy. It's shorter than this one, and it's definitely more of a comedy set in a fantasy world. And I can't say too much about that yet, but it's in the works, and the first book is pretty close to being ready. And that's just more of a really fun project that we did together. Every now and then, he and I will sit down, we'll bounce the Google Doc back and forth, if you will. And sometimes when I go to visit him, we'll literally pass the keyboard back and forth, giggling the entire time that we're writing. So that's just a ton of fun. So not nearly the scope of the rave for sure, but it was a blast to write, which I think comes through in the comedy. But then the other solo project that I'm thinking about, which will be my main effort after the third book is done, The Ruin, is well, let's see, how much can I tell you about it? It's still in its infancy, so there isn't much, but well, I'm toying with a few different ideas for how this should work, and one of them is like, what if there was a post-apocalyptic fantasy world, but it's a comedy? Like, what if everything is just objectively terrible, but everyone's so jaded about it that they just kind of make their existence in this world where like scorpions rain from the sky, and every time the emperor needs to make a grand entrance, he like chops someone's head off so the head will roll down the steps, and he's like, haha. The first idea I had, the first image for this story was exactly that, where it's like someone's coming into the throne room, and the camera pans up this grand decadent like audience chamber, and the emperor is sitting on top of these steps, and there's like people fanning him on either side, and eating grapes, the whole thing. And then he like the head of the like war prisoner rolls down the steps, but the guy wasn't there, like the person wasn't there to see it, so he's like, hang on, back it all up, lead him out of the chamber, have him come in again, and then another war prisoner is marched up. And just like the level of absurdity is mainly what I'm going for. The main character, as I conceive it, would be one of the people waiting in line to have his head chopped off, like just as a matter of ceremony and pomp. So not really sure 100% what the shape of that's going to be, because like I said, all of my efforts are on this trilogy right now. But my blessing and my curse is that ideas are always knocking around my head and like trying to wriggle their way in. So the next thing I write is definitely going to be more of that, an absurd, fantastical comedy that should be a ton of fun to write.
Well, I'm looking forward to that already. That sounds, I don't know, just hearing about all the more comedic stuff, the more absurd stuff that you write has been like, oh, this is interesting. I need to get into some more absurd stuff lately. And
yeah, I mean, it's definitely, my background is more in. Hopefully a little bit of this bleeds through in the Aelfraver trilogy as well. Every now and then there's just sort of something ridiculous that happens, and then we move on. But I can't help but working a little bit of, playful cynicism and ridiculousness into my work sometimes, because it's just fun.
Exactly. What would life be without a little bit of fun and absurdity?
Yeah, you got to laugh, because everything is ridiculous ultimately.
Yes, in the end. So I think the rest of my questions are spoilers for Through the Rebel. So if you have been watching this and you have not read Through the Rebel, which is out now on Amazon, and I'll have the links down below for the Rave, the Rebel, Julian's author page, there'll be a bunch of links down below for you guys. Check them out. And if you have read The Rebel, please continue on, and we'll stay here, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Spoilers from here on out. I'll probably put chapters as well. Who knows?
All right, hit me. I'm ready.
I think my first question has to do with dragons and like why did you write dragons in the way that you did? Because like especially like coming off the first, it's you tease dragons at the end of the rave. Like dragons, this is gonna be, we're gonna get giant lizards, especially after the giant mechanical dragon that you put.
Mm-hmm.
And then dragons turn out to be completely different. Where did that come from?
Yeah, well, a little bit of cheap stage magic misdirection for sure. Yeah, I went into it thinking, all right, what if dragons were different? So, my favorite rendition of dragons that I've ever read personally is Ursula K. Le Guin in The Wizard of Earthsea, that whole cycle. Because I won't spoil it, just in case you want to read it, but let's just say that dragons start off as like the classic powerful fantasy, like you would expect them in, I guess, early Dungeons and Dragons maybe, and maybe in Tolkien as well. But they very quickly become different, and they evolve over time. They're more like, there's a lot more to them, let's say. So I came into it with that mindset, like how do I take something that is the like one of the most common tropes in fantasy and make it different. And I know that everybody says that, but what can you do? You do the best that you can to twist it, this trope. But I have a lot of respect for it because just the word dragon has such weight, historically and mythologically and everything. So the other thing that I thought about going into this, especially the Rebel, was they called Dracula the dragon as well. Another name for Satan is the dragon, the enemy. And since we're in the spoiler section, Alina is very much presented in this book in two different lights. The struggling teenager trying to figure out what her powers are as like disparate chunks of her soul are fusing into her being. And then like from the outside, she grows more and more into this role of like the terrifying thing, the adversary, as they start to call her. So I very much went into it thinking like, in this world, the truth about dragons is that they're more like superpowered sorcerers that have absorbed enough life energy through like dark magic manipulation and essentially necromancy and other things to become like to become more than what they were. Like once you put enough soul energy into one vessel, it kind of bursts outside of its bounds. So when you let's see, what am I trying to say here? I'm trying not to also then spoil things for the Ruin, because obviously this will be more explored in that book too.
Of course.
But yeah, so I think that's what it is. It's the misconception of dragons in this world, sort of a thing that people forgot because they've been extinct for hundreds of years. And even hundreds of years ago, they were just existed on the periphery of human imagination. Dragons are shapeshifters in this world. They can turn into giant beasts. And a lot of other creatures can too. So if you remember at the end of the rave, Dimas can change into, Alina's grandfather can change into the crow beast form. Mm-hmm. And you could argue maybe that's his true form, maybe it's not, but he's a trickster. He's a monstrous entity. And then when Alina takes him in, she spends this book sort of feuding with that half of her soul, trying to retain her individuality, but ultimately having to accept that he is part of her individuality now. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to say two things at once, I guess. The misconception of dragons is that they were these giant chitinous beasts. They were like insectoid, flying, like fire spouting monsters. Because some of them could take that shape a long time ago. But the truth about them is that they were just, super powerful beings that accrued enough magical potential to break the bonds of reality to some extent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully that was somewhat coherent of an answer.
It was. It definitely plays. I do like different interpretations of dragons. I think that I didn't really grow up with D&D, so but I grew up with like Aragon and Tolkien and
Yeah.
some other stuff.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't the concept of a shape shifting dragon was introduced with D&D for me,
Mm-hmm.
but it's always something I enjoy seeing because I feel like there's a lot of interesting stories there that I haven't seen personally yet in terms of the shape shifting aspect of the of that sometimes is attributed to the dragons.
Yeah, and I was interested in the idea that a dragon could be made, pretty much, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a dragon is a title that you affix. It's like a name that you give something that has transcended its limitations. Um,
Yep.
One of my favorite parts of the book, at least my little prosaic moment that I put in there, that maybe no one else cares about, but I really like it. It's the moment where um, it's some paragraph that goes on to the extent of like, you know, dreams are often inconsequential, but every now and then there's this dream of that's fueled by the collective unconscious. And like when enough people are angry enough about something, and when enough power goes into one vessel, that sort of vibe, then that's the moment where the narrator says, Alina becomes a god, no, a dragon, right? um, just this idea that you can pour power into something, and then what that thing does with that power is entirely up to it. uh, so I also am really interested in playing with the idea of, where to take Alina from here. And obviously, I know what she's going to do, but we talked earlier about like, what do you do with all that power once it's yours? Like teenagers throwing fireballs. Well, what if a teenager could like brainwash people or obliterate a city or something, right? Like that sort of level we're playing at now.
Yeah, yeah, and then I think that begs the question of how fast does a teenager grow up as well? I think that's what we see a bunch of in the Rebel, of her just not only reconciling herself with her grandfather, but like her just kind of having being forced to grow up essentially.
Yeah. Um,
Because you can't have power and then with the power understand the responsibility without maturing. Um,
yes. So that I'm glad that you said that, because I that's very much intentional. I wanted the Rebel to be a story about growing up, essentially. She and Lena and Cho both grow up in their own ways. They and with very different results and very different ultimate motivations, I guess. Um, but it is a story about growing up. It's also a story about dealing with grief, loss and all that. And maybe in a somewhat ham-fisted way, but I titled the 7 parts, the first 5 parts with stages of grief, with the sixth and the seventh being like transcending grief.
mm-hmm.
So that was
Yeah,
my.
didn't quite notice that, but I think chapter titles and part titles tend to go over my head normally
No,
anyways.
absolutely. It's not one of those things. Hopefully, it's not one of those things that's necessary. But it's like if you did see it, you might be like, "Huh."
It's a nice little thing. It's a nice little detail that people that notice those things see.
Yeah, and I mean, I try to do that with a lot of different elements in the story. I wanted to just write it in a way where, like, at its first and foremost, a book should be fun. You should have a good time reading it, or you should get, whether it's a comedy or tragedy or whatever, you should get that emotional payoff from it. It should be a
Yep.
good story, and then you can put in all your baloney as an author of like hidden meaning and symbolism and all this other stuff, right? That's sort of the subsurface kind of fun stuff where like if you want to dig for it, it is there,
Yeah.
but you don't have to enjoy it. I'm not a fan of books where like the only way to understand it or get it is to chip away at it with a pickaxe.
Yeah, and you can only understand the hidden meaning. And if you don't understand the hidden meaning, the book is just confusing.
Right. And it's just not for you, because I'm the gatekeeper of what is good content and worthy story.
So the name is escaping me. The sister that's not the sister. That's actually the whatchamacallit. It's actually the love interest from the rave.
Oh, are you talking about? Oh, yeah. Sorry, you're talking about Ivian. Yeah.
Yes. So why did you choose? Was that the only avenue that you thought about utilizing him in this book? Why in the end did you choose that for his kind of arc that we didn't realize was an arc until the end?
Right. Well, um, so in the first book, Orden was the fake ally opponent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like pretending to be on your side, but really he was working against you.
Mm-hmm.
In this book, same thing, right? But I thought, well, can I pull it off again? Can I do it a second time? No, it was more just Ivian's story, Ivian/Orden's story, is meant to reveal a bunch of different things about how this world works. One, if you are well connected enough with the ultimate bad guy that's revealed in the toward the end of the book, the order that secretly controls everything. If you're well connected and rich and powerful enough, you can escape death.
Mm-hmm.
But at what cost? Right? Like, at what point does Orden stop being himself? Right? When he gets crushed by the dragon at the end of the rave, when it falls on him, he's got blue blood. Most of his internal components are machine. Like his voice box starts crackling. He's basically a robot,
Mm-hmm.
basically. So can you call him human anymore? And then in this one, he has like more of an organic body that they kind of grew for him, but he's not even himself anymore. He's pretending so hardcore to be someone else. He assumes that identity. So there's that philosophical question of like, what does it mean to be human? How much can you mess with your concept of self, your organic parts? Like at what point do you become a different thing than you are, right? Like he eliminates his identity as Orden. So that's just interesting.
To me, it feels like he's, especially with that loss of humanity, it feels like he's a little bit of a foil to Cho more than Alina.
Thank you. You nailed it, Pete. You genius. That's exactly you saved me. 100%. Yeah. Because Cho is very much machined, and she even starts like tweaking her own capabilities. Like there's that thing that she does with her arm where she can elastic like throw it far away. She's got like a whip arm, and that's totally her just with a screwdriver in the garage, like seeing how she can mess with her components.
Mm-hmm.
And she also can like exit time by hacking, kind of like by making herself a stream of information. She can exist in two different time frames at once. So yeah, thank you so much for saying that, because that is exactly what I talked earlier about, like the four corner opposition. I structured Ivian to be the foil of Cho, in that like, are they kind of doing the same thing? Are they ultimately that different? Maybe it's the motivations that's important. Maybe it's the results of what they do. Because I mean, Ivian/Orden like took the real Ivian and threw her in a bunker somewhere, so she's a prisoner now, and Orden's running around using his sister's name to do all sorts of, subjectively terrible things.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Cho is just sort of like trying to see how far she can take what she's been given and use it for her own devices. So it's really just, I guess, a matter of like, who do you think is doing the right thing? The person trying to blow up society, or the person trying to preserve it?
Yeah. And it's also kind of goes down to a more base level of nature versus nurture sometimes as well. You could almost argue that Orden there's a lot of things that he was given, a lot of nature that he starts out with, and then he just does some weird things and does some crazy things with it. Whereas Cho was also given by nature a lot of crazy things, and then she does, or she's trying to do good with them.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, another interesting thing that you bring up. They kind of had the same starting point, but then what happened to them drastically changed maybe the trajectory. Like, what if Cho's family wasn't wiped out? Would she have become a lot like her peers, living in a bubble, wealthy, out of touch? I would say that Orden feels like he would probably justify his behavior, as I think he does a little bit in the book, by saying, I'm trying to fix the problem. Let me just become the consul slash president slash king, whatever, and I will make the stuff happen that makes things better. But then the decisions that he makes to get there are destroying and terrible and like resulting in death and suffering. But if he can just become president, he can fix it, right? Like if I just become the consul, it's all solved.
If you give me absolute power, I'll do good with it, right?
Right. I just have to get to the absolute power, but in the meantime, I'm using my power for bad stuff, or at least for stuff that is harmful to a lot of people.
Yes. The end that I want to get to is the good. So the means that I'm using to get there is also good automatically, correct?
Right. Right. And I don't know, maybe Cho is the protagonist just because she recognizes eventually that she's doing things that hurt other people. That's also the purpose of, like, structurally the purpose of Kineas in the story, right? The like hopeless romantic boy who like latches onto her and thinks she's awesome, and she is, but boy does he have like sort of an unhealthy fixation on trying to do the right thing for her, and he pays for it because she does nothing to stop it.
Yeah, she doesn't recognize the responsibility of her actions, or doesn't recognize the responsibility she needs to have over her actions.
Yeah.
Because her actions affect more than just her now. Especially because she's not on the street anymore.
Right. Yeah, she's not just the plucky little orphan, like, stealing pocket change. Now there are people who, for some reason, she keeps falling into these nests of, like, super critical, difficult, dangerous activity. And part of that's her own fault because she keeps going around the internet, the fantasy internet, saying that she's the chosen one, right?
Yep.
She's not Cho anymore. She's Chosen. Like, that's her whole thing. She's created a persona for herself, and people start believing it. That's the other thing I wanted to kind of do with this book. Like, what if Cho creates a personality for herself, a shadow personality, and people start to buy it because she actually is pretty tough and capable. Alina keeps trying to like push people away from her. Like, I'm not the thing you think I am, but they refuse to believe her because she's also like a super powerful, magical person.
Mm-hmm.
The whole Akamir like legend around her, which will be further explored in book 3, of course.
I would hope so.
But there are some amusing scenes where they're like, it's just what she does because she's the chosen, she's the Akamir. And she's like, would you just stop saying that? Leave me alone.
Leave me alone. I just want to live in a hut in the wilderness.
Yeah. I think if she had the choice, she probably would try to do that. But yeah, so the just one more thing about the Kineas Cho Ivian thing. Kineas and Cho's relationship is sort of, I guess, a microcosm of Ivian and like the level of influence that Ivian has. Commanding armies and being like this close to becoming the nominally most powerful person in the world, which she does at the end. Like, she's sitting in her little fortress of solitude watching like the city burn in the distance, and all of her political enemies, it's implied, are getting assassinated off somewhere, and she's like, well, I've done it. So I guess Cho kind of learned that she is responsible for the people who follow her, and Ivian did not. And maybe that's the one biggest difference between them. The thing that makes Cho more human, maybe. Empathy.
That whole empathy thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like I planned it this way.
What? There's a plan?
Yeah.
So, speaking of the fantasy internet, I have vague questions about it. Because, like, I feel like there's a lot of similarities between the Revoscape that Alina goes into, the dreamscape, or whatever.
Yeah.
And then, like,
the ether thread, dark thread combo.
Yeah, the ether thread, dark thread. Like,
yeah.
Are they connected? Because I feel like they're almost the same thing. Similar.
What the hell? Yeah, they're the same thing.
Okay.
They're the same. People don't want to believe it. So what happened was, the Authority carved out a niche in the Revoscape.
Okay.
And they were like, okay, so what we want is we want a way to monitor everybody and like stream information constantly and just have this sort of information network. What do we have? We have magic and technology. Revomancy is kind of a dying art, but they did have revomancers sort of work on the architecture of the ether threads.
Mhm.
And it's powered to some extent by, well, there's that the thing that I keep referring to as the abyss, the capital A. It's all kind of interconnected because the Revescape is powered by unconsciousness, the collective unconscious and dreams. And the ether threads are a splinter of that. And even that splinter is effectively infinite, right?
Mhm.
Because there's so much there's so much data there and so much so it's so expansive that there's really no realistic ceiling to that they're going to run into anytime soon. But the Revescape is a multiverse unto itself, connecting the consciousnesses not just of the creatures on this world, but all creatures that have sentience.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, good catch. There may be like some cryptic references to it in the Revel somewhere, but you're welcome. Everyone's welcome to make up their own interpretations as well. I'm not saying that all other answers are wrong, but in my opinion, the way that I wrote it is the ether threads are a splinter of the Revescape, which is why they function so similarly. And the dark threads are like the criminal version of the ether threads, which is a splinter of the ether threads. That's just sort of like, the dark side of the internet running on the other side of the official business. But that's why it's kind of interesting to me, at least, why, how Cho is able to bounce around in a virtual world, which, what are dreams if not a virtual world? Yeah.
Makes sense. So Cho in her own right is a Refomancer, which is interesting.
Yeah. And at numerous occasions in the book, people are like, "You're not a mage. What do you know?" And she's like, "I know I'm not a mage, but like, what's the difference between super technology powered by magic and a mage?"
Exactly. Yeah.
I definitely wanted to kind of walk that edge in this book.
Yeah, especially considering some of the other things you've put in, like even from the very beginning with Alina catching the greed demon and tossing it into an email.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for the callback. That's 100%. This book was meant to be, how do I take everything that I've already established and dial it up to 11? How do I reveal more about how this all works and connect it together? You think that you're reading about Alina and Cho doing two different things and following two different paths, but ultimately everything is just pushing them back together, from their personal choices to like how reality itself works and how they interact with it.
Yeah, definitely.
And there will be more of that stuff in the Ruin. The conflict that's coming is going to include, more revelations about how that all works.
Yes, and I enjoy that. I think one thing that you've done a good job with this series about with the world building is not giving everything up too early, if that makes any sense. I've read some series where everything is given to you in the very first book, everything about the world you need to know. And then I think that's actually part of what makes up the middle book syndrome, where you have these giant reveals in the first book. There's this wonder of discovery in the first book, and then in the second book it's just like, oh, there's nothing more to discover, so like
and now I'm just waiting around for the conclusion to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's one way I think you were able to avoid the second book syndrome, was not only having a complete, not necessarily separate plot, but a cohesive plot that wasn't, the only purpose was not just to set up the third book, like that was part of it, but there was also this continued wonder of discovery.
Well, that's super flattering. Thank you very much for saying so. I was really hoping that would be the case, because I'm totally on board with you on that. I enjoy most of the stories where each installment kind of points a different angle on the world or gives you a spotlight on a different facet. I don't know. There's so many good examples that I guess I could say Ursula K. Le Guin I think is very good with that. A Wizard of Earthsea is sort of like a novella length classic high fantasy adventure with a lot of heart and you know, beauty in the prose and the narrative. But then the books after that really start to dive into who is this character and how did he come to be this way, and like, let's go to this corner of the world and show you what this is like, and then let's show you how that fits in with here. Now let's talk about where the magic school came from. And you're
Mm.
always learning about new things that fit in so well with what came before. Um, I think Terry Pratchett's honestly a very good example of that too. Every single one of his books, they get better as you go, but every single one of his books like shows you a different part of the city that's absolutely bonkers, but totally fits in with what you expected from before.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'm about to read Going Postal with some friends this next month.
Going Postal, I love that book. That's one of my favorites because I think it's one of the best self-contained, like just fun stories.
Yeah.
Certainly in the Discworld series, I love that story.
Yeah. I've only read Guards, and then I read Color of Magic.
Yeah.
So yeah, I actually read like the first chapter of Going Postal in college, but that was when I was in the constant. Hi, I'm in college, so I have a lot of things going on. So I'm constantly DNFing books and series because I just don't have time, and then forgetting where I was. So I'm definitely I've always been interested in Going Postal, but then I read Color of Magic. I was like, this is okay. And then I read Guards. I was like, oh, this is great.
Yeah. Color of Magic is like, I enjoyed it. I read it when I was a kid. And it's very much a parody of fantasy more than anything else, I would say. It's very colorful and it's a fun romp and everything, but it is definitely like, let's take some fantasy tropes and make fun of them in a playful and fun way. Guards starts to get into, there are other books as well, but Guards is like, let me give you a police drama with a dragon and a secret society and all sorts of other weirdness. And then that whole the whole arc with the City Watch, that's my favorite arc in the series just because I really like all those characters. And it's always like some crime or some mystery that they're trying to solve in a totally ridiculous way, but that makes sense in the logic of the world. And Sam Vimes is like one of my favorite characters of all time, just because he's, gritty British Clint Eastwood, like, but with a heart of gold. What's there not to love?
Exactly.
But Going Postal is such a good self-contained mystery. I think I'm hoping you really enjoy it, and I'm definitely interested to hear what you think.
That's the plan. So I'll put something out about it at some point, maybe. I don't know. I have a bunch of. This month is a lot of. I'm finishing five. I'm supposed to finish 5 different series, so that's going to be interesting.
Wow, jeez.
Yeah, it's wild.
I mean, you put a lot on your plate, and I'm so thrilled that my book was one of them. To be honest, like it's such an honor to be even like mentioned in the same video as like so many talented self-published and traditionally published authors. It's a massive thrill.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's booktube. I mean, I love discovering new authors and discovering new things, and I've definitely tried to put a stop on. Not necessarily put a stop, slow down the growth of the TBR a little bit because I have too many books to read. But at the same time, I'm always like looking for great books to read. It's the duality of man of like, I don't want to grow my TBR, but I want more books, more good books to read.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely feel you there. I've got more books than I can read with the schedule that I keep with my job and writing and everything. But I'm chipping away at it piece by piece.
Exactly.
I do the same thing with movies and games, though. I'm like, but it's only $8, or like, wow, I can get 10 books on thrift books for like $15.
Thrift books is bad.
Yeah, it's helped my pocketbook. Actually, you know what? I've probably whatever I would have saved in money, I've spent on like additional books now that I have to get to. But
yeah,
time and money, those are the two big currencies.
Yeah, I've had to like cut back on doing my best about only buying books that I know I'm going to read or I currently intend to read, with some exceptions. Like when I went to Ireland, I picked up a bunch of books that just looked interesting.
Yeah.
Like for the most part, it's like let's chill out. You have enough, if enough exists, but like you have plenty of books on your physical everything that you will be fine for like 3 years.
Right. Yeah, you could comfortably survive for a while. I don't know. My aunt always used to say. I mean, she still would say today that you can never have too many books, and I agree in principle, but there's a physical limit to the amount of space that I have
Yes.
before it starts to, it's at a certain point, like it's gonna bust out of that door behind me.
Yeah.
And fly out of the windows and everything.
I have not quite reached the ceiling, but I am like 6 inches away.
Yeah, I can see you're getting close, but you know what? You're supporting authors in the meantime, so I'm sure that I speak for all of them when I say thanks for that support. It means a lot.
Always happy to help. So is there anything else you want to leave readers with regards to your books or anything along those lines?
That's a tough one. I feel like I should have had like a witty sign out ready, or like something clever to say here. I guess thank you for reading if you've read. I hope that you'll give it a try if you haven't. I appreciate everyone who supported me, the comments, the reviews, the booktubers, the bookstagram people. It's all been so awesome to just be able to make new friends and talk to people. And I guess I'll just borrow the Bill and Ted quote, be excellent to each other, because ultimately, if there are any heroic aspects of the trilogy that I'm writing, and if there's anything that fits in with my philosophy on life, it's, there is not any way to be too empathetic to other people. You cannot overdose on empathy. So go in trying to see what other people think. Try to be cool to each other on a personal level, on a professional level, and whatnot. And I think reading helps with that because we get to walk inside of the minds and shoes of others, in a figurative sense.
So. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pete. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. And
finally we got to do this after like 2 or 3 reschedules.
Yeah, well, it was worth the wait. That's what's important.
Thank you so much for watching, everybody. There will be links down below to his website, his books, all this other jazz. Check it out. Buy the books. Read the books. It's great. Thank you so much. And make sure to get some rest because that's important.
Yes, I second the motion.